In today's video, we're going to be building my new CCTV setup, using these HikVision Smart Hybrid Colour View cameras and an NVR running Frigate. So what we'll do today is we'll take a look at the hardware we're using, take a look at the cameras, talk about what I've gone for, why I've gone for them. We'll build the NVR, get that set up, install some of the cameras, and then we'll talk about my experience. And I'm really excited to try all this out because these cameras look really, really cool, and the Frigate software looks absolutely brilliant for what I'm looking to do. So first up, let's talk about the cameras I've gone for. And I've decided to go for these HikVision Smart Hybrid Colour View cameras, which are a pretty new camera they've launched, and these seem absolutely fantastic. Now, of course, the big thing to bear in mind is there are definitely privacy concerns around using products from the likes of HikVision, and that's why here I am using HikVision cameras, but I'm not using a HikVision NVR. The cameras are easy to completely isolate on their own network, completely have them on their own VLAN, no ability to talk out to the internet, no ability to talk to even anything on my local network. These can be completely isolated, so I'm happy for that from a privacy perspective. But on the other hand, I wouldn't really want a HikVision NVR sitting on my local network with access to the internet and things like that. Of course, it's up to you whether you want to use any kind of HikVision products at all, but realistically, as soon as you try and avoid cameras made by the likes of HikVision and Dahua, especially factoring that they make a lot of cameras for other brands, it really cuts down your options and means you're limited to very expensive cameras generally. And these look absolutely fantastic value for what I'm looking to do. So when I say these are smart hybrid cameras, this is kind of a new classification of camera that HikVision have brought in. Previously, they had what they called their Darkfighter cameras and then separately had their Colour View cameras. The Darkfighter cameras were generally designed for low light performance, but when the light got below a certain level, they would switch over to infrared and work in infrared. And that's fairly typical of most CCTV cameras, but the Darkfighter ones, the idea was that they could work at a much lower light level before they had to switch to infrared. But of course, when a camera does switch to infrared, it goes black and white. The Colour View cameras, on the other hand, offered the idea of having very good low light colour performance and didn't have infrared. A lot of other manufacturers are also introducing products like this, and the idea is that they work down to very low light levels, giving a colour image. But in complete darkness, or like a super low brightness level, to give some sort of supplemental light to allow the camera to work at all, they would have some sort of white LED on the front to give a bit of ambient light. And I'm actually starting to see these sorts of cameras more around in public, seeing like on the sides of houses a camera with a white light on it. They're starting to become more mainstream. These hybrid ones, on the other hand, are kind of the best of both worlds, because the idea is that they offer full colour night vision, they work down to a very, very low light level, but these have both a white light and infrared. And you can kind of adjust how you want to switch between them. So you can either use them just to switch to infrared if it's too dark, or you can have them maybe switch to the white light. Or for example, if you don't want a permanent white light shining from the side of your house on the camera, you could have them do infrared normally, but if they detect a person, then switch over to the white light to, first of all, kind of startle the person, make them look up at the camera, which is quite a good thing. And also then at that point, if there's a person there, you could then get a better colour image and see what colour of clothes they're wearing and things like that. These were very expensive, but because I'm installing this sort of for the first time really doing a big outdoor CCTV setup, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to go for in terms of infrared versus white supplemental light. So getting these means I can just install the cameras and then configure them and play about with what I want in terms of supplemental light, which should be really good. So now in terms of the cameras I've gone for a few different models from the same sort of range. I've gone for 5 different cameras. I've managed to lose the box for one of them, and I've already installed a couple of them at this point, so I thought I'd kept the boxes to use as props. I've managed to lose one. But what we've got here, if we turn them around, is we can see what we have are 3 4-megapixel cameras, which are essentially 2K, and then 2 8-megapixel cameras. I've only got one here, but 2 8-megapixel or 4K cameras. And I'm kind of going to just deploy them based on where that sort of resolution would work best. So in areas that I don't really care about, or if the camera's going to be quite close to the subject, I'm just going to put the 4-megapixel ones in. But where I want a much wider shot and the camera's going to be further away from the subject, I've gone for the higher resolution 8-megapixel models. And then when it comes to 8-megapixel ones, I've gone for 2 different types. This one, which is a standard camera, and the other one I've gone for, I can't remember the model number. The HikVision model numbers are, as you can see, quite horrible to remember. But it's the same as this 8-megapixel one, but it's also got a built-in speaker and built-in sort of flashing warning lights. So the idea with that one is that one's going to go in the back garden, so if someone's, say, in the back garden, they shouldn't be there, the camera can play an audible warning and flash some lights to hopefully startle them, act as a deterrent, and again, hopefully make them look up towards the camera and get a facial image. That was a little bit more expensive, and I don't really need that at, say, the front of the house, because I don't want a camera at the front of the house shouting at people, I just want one at the back, so I've gone for those 2 separate cameras. Now, when it comes to buying these cameras, one bit of advice I would just say to be very careful with is, because we're dealing with kind of professional CCTV kit here, not kind of consumer basic IP camera systems, these cameras are available as both an IP version and an analog TVI version. And at first glance, they can look very, very similar on a website, and you can very easily accidentally buy the wrong camera, think, oh, that looks like a really good deal for it, buy it, and end up with essentially an analog camera. So these are obviously the IP camera versions. I would just say if you're looking around to buy these cameras, or really any kind of HikVision or professional CCTV cameras, if you're looking for an IP camera, just double check the model you're buying is the IP camera version. So that was a bit of a talk about why I've gone for these smart hybrid models out of the whole HikVision range. But these cameras also have one feature that made me basically exclusively look at these HikVision cameras over most other cameras on the market. And we'll take it out of the box to talk about that particular feature. So get out of the box, see what we get. Of course, you get manual. You get a mounting template, so you can put it on the wall, drill the holes. I've got rendered walls, so this didn't really stick to it, so I just tended to use it with just drill directly through the base. I've already installed a couple of these cameras, and then we'll go back and take a look at the footage of me installing them. I won't get them all installed in this video, just because the weather's not great at the moment, and I don't fancy trying to get them all in, but I'll get a few of the cameras installed on this video. But yep, here we have the camera, so we'll get that out there. And then in the box, you get an Allen key, which you will need to take different parts of the base off. Essentially, it's Torx screws, so it comes with that. Of course, you don't need it. You could use a screwdriver, but you get that. You get some raw plugs and screws. My advice would be, don't use the screws and raw plugs it comes with. They're not very good, basically. You get these absolutely tiny little plugs, and if I put those on my house, they'd basically fix into the render and not even go into the brick behind. They're just tiny, tiny little plugs. So I would definitely say, I mean, maybe if you're putting on a bare brick, it would be okay, but I'd recommend don't use the little rubbish screws and plugs that come with. Get some proper good quality screws and plugs so you can get it up nice and securely. And for my setup here, I'm also using stainless steel screws just so they don't corrode and either chew when I then try and take them down inevitably in the future, or you end up with that situation where on a light coloured render wall, the screws corrode and you get that brown staining down from the screws. So I've used better screws. So got the camera there. And then you get this gland here for connecting the cable up, and we'll take a look at this in a minute. Okay, so now here we have the camera, so let's take a look at it. So I've opted to go for these turret cameras. Of course, there's lots of different options, but I find the bullet cameras just don't look that good on the side of a house. They're quite big. And the dome cameras can be good because they're very vandal resistant. These are much less vandal resistant than a dome camera. But a dome camera, you can have issues where the glass dome can steam up, get moisture in it, or even just reflect light weirdly, whereas turret cameras will generally give you a better image. So they're quite large. They're not the smallest cameras in the world, but they're absolutely fine. That's the camera there, so you've got the lens on the front, the two LEDs, which are both white LEDs, and then you also have infrared LEDs behind this. The other camera I've got that's the same as this is the 8 megapixel one, that's got the built-in speaker, also has some additional LEDs in here that'll flash red and blue, I think, although I've not really tested those out yet. But yeah, we've got that on the front, and this all kind of pivots around and moves, so you can kind of just move this around and position it how you want it. Both the camera itself tilts up and down inside the body, and then the whole thing rotates around as well on the base. Now, this is something to consider with a turret camera, is you can't lock that off at all. So if this is mounted and someone can get up to the camera, they could go up and potentially rotate the camera and position it away. Now, for me, all but one of my cameras will be high enough up that you're not getting them without a ladder, so it's not the end of the world, but it is something to consider. At that point, you may want to look more towards a dome camera, because with that, you can lock off the motion inside the glass dome. But yeah, that's the camera there. And then here we have the pigtail. Now, this is why I have gone specifically for these new HikVision generation cameras. Because with a lot of turret cameras, in fact, almost the vast majority of turret cameras, they have this, what I'm going to refer to as a stupid pigtail. The way it works is you have this cable that comes out the camera that's hardwired in basically into the back of the camera. It then comes out over a cable, breaks out, and then here you have your Ethernet connection there. It does support PoE. And then if you don't want to use PoE, you also get a 12 volt DC input. And this is something that the vast majority of high-end professional IP cameras have. Some manufacturers don't, but generally when you're going to that realm where they don't have this and instead have a connector directly on the back of the camera, they're just extremely expensive. You look at the really high-end brands like the likes of Axis, and they're just way beyond my budget. So at the kind of price point I'm looking at, I'm basically limited to cameras that have this pigtail. And this has a bit of a problem, because if you want to mount a camera flush on a wall and you've got this big bundle of cable sticking out the back with a big connector on it, what do you do with that? I don't really fancy drilling a hole that size in a wall to push this back into the wall. So generally speaking, when you want to mount a camera that's got a pigtail like this, on a solid brick wall, what you have to do is use some sort of junction box, where either you have the camera mounted to the wall flush like that, you then have the cable coming out the bottom of the camera, and then the lead going up into a junction box maybe next to the camera and wired in there, or you can get a mounting base for these cameras. It's essentially a big round junction box that you screw to the wall, put the cable inside it, make this junction box, this connection off inside that back box, and then mount the camera to the box. And the problem with that is it looks quite ugly. Fair enough, on a commercial install, that's absolutely fine, but if I'm going to have 5 of these around my house, I don't want these massive big junction boxes or surface cables and stuff like that. I want it all to be really neat. And this is something that HikVision have finally done with this new generation of cameras. And what they've done is they've just made this mounting base a bit deeper. So if you look at lots of older HikVision cameras or ones from other brands and just generally lower end cameras, they tend to stop basically here. They just kind of cut off flush, and there's literally no space in the back to make off any connections. Whereas with this new generation from HikVision, you've got that little bit of additional depth there. Now, from experience putting these in, there is not much space in here. It's quite awkward, and when it's freezing cold outside, you do end up swearing quite a lot trying to get it all in. But you can loop the cable around inside like that, get it all kind of tucked in, and you can just about get it so the cable can be hidden in the back and it can sit completely flush on a wall. So that's why I've gone for these, because I want to have these cameras on a wall. I don't want any junction boxes, and what this means is I can bring a cable straight out the wall, make off the connection, carefully manipulate it into this back box here, and I can actually mount these flush to a wall without any kind of external junction box or raised back box. So yeah, these are really, really good. I'm really glad HikVision have finally launched these. Other thing is it comes with this little rubber plug that goes in there if you're surface mounting it and you don't want a cable coming out this hole. Just watch, because this was very easy to lose. When I took it out of the bag, it pinged across the room and I couldn't find it. So just bear in mind that is there if you are going to mount these. And yeah, that's what you get. So next up, let's talk about how you make the connections off. We'll see this all properly when we're outside actually installing the camera, but I thought I'd show it on a desk here because it's going to be a lot easier to see here than me balancing up a ladder. So of course, if you're making off this connection, especially if you're hiding it in the bottom of the camera, water could get into it. It's obviously not going to be exposed to direct rain or anything, but if water's running down the wall, it is going to potentially get into the back of this. So for that, this connection is actually designed to be waterproof. So in the back box, you get this little pack here. This sort of stuff is fairly common, so if you've installed IP cameras before, you probably already know this. Feel free to skip ahead. But for people who haven't seen it before, what you get is these pieces here. And the idea is that you put these onto your cable, then connect it in, and it waterproofs it. So to put all this together, what we need to do is we've got a cable here, and you need to assemble this waterproof gland onto the cable you're going to connect, and then you can put this all together. Now what is quite nicely designed with this is you can actually assemble this gland onto the cable even once the connector's crimped onto the end. That's pretty good. I was worried if you'd have to do it before the connector's on. But to quickly demonstrate this, what we need to do is we need to first of all feed over this end cap there. Then you want to feed on this rubber piece. It's kind of split in the middle, so you can easily feed it on over the cable. Then what you want to do is, trying to remember the order of this, we want to then feed this over the connector there, so you can feed this, will fit over a plug if you're careful. He says, realizing it's not fitting. There we go. There's a slight square shape inside that, so you need to kind of get it the right way around, but now that's over there. We can then feed the rubber plug into the end like that. Next up, we take the end cap, and we can put that end cap over there, and that will kind of still slide up and down the cable. Take the connector on the camera, put this little rubber seal washer O-ring thing just around the bottom of that, just to provide a good seal. Plug the connector in like that, slide the outer body down, put it on, rotate it round so that connects up like that, and then you can just tighten this gland onto the end to seal it all up and waterproof it. So that'll go on there, and this will now make off a completely waterproof connection. So this can safely sit outside, get water on it, and it's not really going to be a problem there. So that's kind of what we need to do. And then once that's all done, as we saw before, the whole thing will, if you're careful enough, kind of snake around inside the camera, and you will be able to kind of connect this up and make it off inside the back of the camera. Now, you are going to be bending the cable quite tight. You're probably not going to be obeying the bend radius of the network cable doing this, but it'll work absolutely fine. And that's, yeah, works great. So that's kind of how you make off one of these cameras, and we'll see this properly when we install one later. So that's the cabling side of things. In terms of mounting it, all you need to do is there's this plastic collar here you can rotate and then take off. That comes off there. Then under here you'll find there's 3 mounting holes to screw that to the wall. So pretty easy to put on the wall. And then you can also remove the camera from the base using this little Torx screw here, which you can also use the included Allen key for. So if you use that there, you can undo that screw there, which will loosen off this little metal piece, being careful not to scratch lens with that. Then that leaves this little metal piece here, which will shift up and then slide backwards from the base there. And that then unlocks the camera, which can then also be removed completely from the mounting base. And this is especially if you wanted to mount this onto a back box. So if you did want to mount this onto a back box, you would use these screws under here to mount to the back box. Or potentially if you're mounting it on a wall and actually for some reason these screw holes don't work, you could probably use these ones as well. I've kind of found a bit of a weird combination when I install this, where I kind of need to mount it to the wall with the mounting base, the camera attached to the base, and then take the camera off the wall so I can get a silicone gun up in and then seal the hole and then put the camera back. But we'll talk about that later when we actually go to install it. But yeah, that's kind of the construction of the camera. All the cameras are basically the same. The only exception is that other one I mentioned that has the speaker built in. It just has a couple of additional connectors on it. It's got one for analog audio in and I think maybe out from the microphone and speaker. And then it's got another one for kind of analog alarm connections that you can connect up to some sort of NVR alarm terminal or something like that for signaling it. You don't need to use that, it can all be done over IP, but it just has those additional connectors. And all it says in the manual is just to tape over all the original connectors, the unused connectors, just to waterproof them. Even for this DC one that does have a rubber plug in it, the manual does say to kind of just tape over it as well, just to stop water getting in there. So that's what I'll be doing. So that was a look at the cameras. Now let's talk about the NVR. And for that, we're going to be using this little Dell Optiplex 5070 Micro. And if this looks familiar, you might have seen my previous video where I installed the CCTV system in my flat, where I used this little machine to run Blue Iris, which is really nice Windows-based NVR software. So this runs Windows, it runs Blue Iris for NVR support. Now, Blue Iris was great, but for the setup here, instead of that, I'm going to be trying out some software called Frigate, which is really cool looking open source NVR software that runs on Linux. And what Frigate focuses on is having really good AI and machine learning based object detection. Blue Iris does have that as well, but Frigate just seems a bit newer and the mobile interface looks a lot better. When I've previously built this NVR, I did actually look at Frigate, but at the time the UI just wasn't great and Blue Iris did look like a much better option. But relatively recently, Frigate has had a massive UI overhaul and the new UI looks absolutely brilliant. I've played about with it a little bit, and to be honest, it's really up there with some of the nicest NVR user experiences I've experienced, which is really pretty good. It's maybe not quite up there with like Unify Protect, which is still my favourite from a sort of overall user experience perspective, but in terms of the features around AI object detection, Frigate looks like a fantastic option. So yeah, we're going to be running it on this machine here, because obviously Frigate requires some sort of Linux-based device. You can run it on a PC, you can technically run it on like a Raspberry Pi, but you're maybe pushing it a bit in terms of CPU power if you're running, you know, 2 4K and 3 2K cameras like I'm doing here. So this machine should be absolutely fine. Now, this won't be my full-time NVR. This is just sort of temporary stopgap before I can build a dedicated rack mount NVR. Realistically, this is fine from a CPU power perspective, but unfortunately this machine can only take a single 2.5-inch hard drive, and it only takes relatively sort of standard thickness drives. It won't take any really thick 2.5-inch hard drives. Which means with this, I'm really limited to maybe 2 terabytes of total storage. I've got 1 terabyte in here currently, which just won't be enough. So at some point in the future, hopefully fairly soon, I'll be building a dedicated rack mount NVR that'll take a couple of full-size 3.5-inch hard drives. But for now, this will do the job and it'll just get me going. In terms of power, we don't need a huge amount of power here. I think this has like an Intel i5 9th gen. I think it's maybe the low power version. Is it the T model? Is that 9500T? I want to guess. Just guessing that. I think it's got 8 gigs of RAM. It's nothing particularly powerful, but it should be absolutely fine for what we're doing. But with Frigate, there's one more piece of hardware that significantly improves the performance. And it's this little device here, which is called a Coral TPU. Now this is a project from Google, and essentially it's a tensor processing unit. So a tiny little chip designed for really fast machine learning type object detection applications. So it's designed very much for a lot of computer vision applications. I think some speech processing it can also be used for. And the idea is that that Frigate can offload a lot of the object detection and image processing over to this, which gives really, really fast object detection and also frees up the resources on the machine's main CPU. And these aren't expensive. I think these cost maybe £30, something like that. The model I've gone for here is an M.2 model, and I think this is the A/E key, I think. You can get a couple of different versions of the keying, so it depends what sort of slot you want to put it in. Or you can get it as a USB module, or you can even get some single board computers with this built in. But I've gone for this here, so we'll put this into the Optiplex, and that'll give it much better performance for all the object detection. So that's really the only hardware thing we need to do, is we need to get this installed. So may as well do it on camera just to kind of run through it. Not that it's very exciting, but yeah, we'll get this installed. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to building a dedicated NVR for this. It doesn't need to be anything super powerful. It'll probably be fairly similar spec to this, maybe even a bit lower spec, maybe just maybe a current generation i3, something like that. It doesn't need to be hugely powerful because this Coral TPU does a lot of the work. And it's quite clever the way it works. I'm very much simplifying here, but what happens is Frigate does the initial motion detection, so if it detects an area of pixels have changed, it will then cut that area where the motion was detected out, scale it down to a very low resolution, and send that to the Coral TPU, which performs the object detection. So the CPU in Frigate is kind of looking at the picture and going, oh, there's a bit of motion there, and then it sends it to this for this to define, is it a person, is it a dog, is it a cat, is it a car, is it just a tree? And that's what I'm really looking forward to this, is having proper object detection, so I can actually get customized and accurate alerts. I don't want my phone going off if a cat runs past the window or a tree branch blows, but if a person is detected in the back garden when I'm away from home and my alarm's set, I kind of want to be told immediately. And by having proper object detection, I can have a situation like that safely trigger a phone call to me and tell me that there's a person in the back garden, because it should be accurate enough that I'm not going to get disturbed because a cat ran through the garden or something like that. So yeah, we need to get this installed. So open up the machine here. We've got the hard drive in here already, which is just a 1 terabyte, 2.5-inch drive. This is the one I was using with Blue Iris before. I'll just use the same drive. It won't have enough record time really for me long term, but I'll be replacing the machine with a better one. And then to install it here, we're going to install it in place of the Wi-Fi card. This machine also has an M.2 SSD we could replace as well, but that would require a different keying of the module. You need a differently keyed module. They do that one as well, but this one would work in place of a Wi-Fi card. This does actually use the PCI Express protocol, so even this kind of key type does support USB as well. This is actually using PCIe. And I think if you're setting it up, there is some sort of additional driver you do need to install on Linux to make it work. I think the USB ones just plug and play, the PCIe one you do need to install drivers for. But yep, if we just take out the Wi-Fi card here, we can just remove that from the slot. Take this little plastic thing off, remove the antennas carefully. We'll need to do something to those to stop them moving around. Take the new module, put that in, and then we will screw that back down. So get screw in there. Just like that. And I'll now get a little bit of tape just to put over these just to keep them safe, because I don't want these loose bits of metal rattling around inside the case. And we get this put back together. Okay, so that's Coral TPU now installed there, and I've done a very messy job of taping over the old Wi-Fi antenna connections just to keep them safe. So we can now put this back together. So stick the hard drive in like that. Set the case back on. I absolutely love these little Optiplexes for stuff like this. And to be honest, I think once I end up replacing this with a better NVR, I might even use this as like a little VM host or something, because it's a really nice little machine. So yep, that's now put together like that. So what I can now do is go and get Frigate installed on this and get it set up. Now, I'm not going to do a full software setup tutorial just because it's not really something I'm very good at, and there's a lot of good material out there for installing Frigate, but I'll go away, get it installed, and then towards the end of the video, we'll maybe take a quick look at the configuration side of things of how I've got this set up. But yep, that's the NVR there. So what we'll now do is we'll jump outside, get a camera installed, and then we'll get everything set up and working. So now it's time to start installing the cameras on the outside of the house. So as you can see in the upstairs bedroom here, we have 2 different cables coiled up out the floor. And I ran these in when I previously ran all the cables. I forgot to show this on the video, so a few people asked, what are you doing about cameras? I did actually run some camera cables and I just forgot to show them. So they're currently coiled up above the floor. We have one here for a camera on the back wall of the house, and one here for a camera on the side wall of the house. So what we need to do is get these to outside, and we can install the cameras. There's other kit cameras as well that are going to go in, but we'll focus on these ones for now. So what we need to do is drill a hole to outside and get the cable out. At this point you have 2 different options. You can either drill from inside to out or outside to in. Drilling inside to out is generally seen as the safer way of doing it, because you know exactly what's behind where you're drilling. You're not going to hit a pipe or anything because you can see what you're drilling into. And it also means you don't need to really measure as much. You just drill inside to out and you'll find your thing on the outside. The risk with that though is there's a much higher risk of blowing a brick, where you'll end up popping a big chunk of brick out, which isn't a structural issue or anything, but it will, look quite ugly, especially if you take the camera down in the future or move it, you'll have a big bit of blown brick you need to deal with. So for this, because of that, I'm going to drill outside to in. Also in particular, because this house is rendered, the last thing I want to do is blow a massive chunk of render off the side of the house, and that would look absolutely hideous. So I'm going to drill outside to in, and with that you just need to be a lot more careful. So you need to check in the floor or in the wall, wherever you're drilling into, that there's definitely no pipes or cables you're going to hit. And then you also just need to be very careful with measurements to make sure that when you drill in, you drill to where you wanted to drill to. So for that, the best way to do it is look for things like window reveals. So there's a window here, I want to measure off of that to here, so I know exactly roughly where I am from the window. You want to measure off of floor height, ceiling height. Basically what you need to do is try and find points on the inside of the house, measure that you can also see on the outside of the house. So that's things like windows, extractor ducts potentially, pipes that pass straight through a wall, things like that. So you can kind of measure off of them on the inside, measure off of them on the outside, and then use that to kind of figure out where you are on the outside. Of course, you need to be very careful with that. For example, with a window reveal like this, the edge of the window reveal on the inside might not exactly match the window reveal on the outside. They might be slightly different sizes, so you kind of need to factor that into your measurements. It's quite a hard thing to explain. Basically, you just need to measure a lot, be extremely careful, just measure off as many points as you want, and if you find a couple of your measurements don't line up with what you're expecting, try again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure off of all that kind of stuff, figure out on the outside wall where basically here is, but under the floor. So I want to drill in from outside and come basically straight into here, into the underfloor area. We're going to get the cable out, and that should be fine. I'm also going to be drilling up at a slight angle, so I'm going to kind of try and aim for slightly towards the bottom of the floor void, so when I drill up at an angle, it'll come out roughly in the middle, and that should work fine. So yes, I need to get the measurements done, and then drill in, and hopefully we'll hit the right spot. So to do that, first of all, I'm going to use an SDS drill. I'm going to use a small drill bit first, just to make a sort of pilot hole, and then we'll swap up that to a big 12mm drill bit. And then, because this house is timber framed, the outside layer of brick is, well, block work, and then the inside layer behind the cavity is timber. So this drill bit won't really go through the timber properly. So instead what I'll do is after that, after I drill the block work, I'll then swap it out for this spade bit, drill through the wood. I might then put this 12mm drill bit through afterwards just to widen it out, because this is 10mm, so it's a bit smaller than the SDS bit. And with all of these holes drilled, we should be through to inside. So let's get the pilot hole in and start drilling this hole. Okay, so now time to drill the pilot hole first, and of course we're going to drill up at a slight angle just so we can stop any moisture running up the cable into the house. So let's see if this works. There we go. So now time to widen this out with a bigger drill bit. Cool, so it's now time to widen it out. Probably mentioned before, but I absolutely love this little 12V SDS. It's just so useful for these sort of things, awkward positions up a ladder. So yep, go through the full size drill bit. We should then be through the block work. Cool, so now that's me through the block work and now hitting the timber on the inside. So we'll swap this drill out for a normal drill, use a spade bit, get through the timber, and we should be into that underfloor void. So spade bit now, this is slightly smaller than the outer hole, so it should fit through there quite easily. Like that, so let's drill through and hopefully we'll end up under the floor. There we go, I think that's me in. Feel it kind of binding up, and I think that's it catching on insulation on the inside, so that's a good sign that we should be in. So what I'll now do is I'll take that completely out, we'll put a cable rod in, and then we'll hopefully be through. But yeah, that's us there. Actually, what I'll do is I'll use the SDS bit just to widen that hole out, because it will at least widen it, and then we'll get a cable rod in. So finally go with the SDS, not on hammer anymore, just so I can widen that existing hole I've made out. There we go. That hole's a little bit wider, so now hopefully, if we get this out, we can poke a cable rod through and get a cable out. Cool, so now the hole all drilled and widened out, we can now put a cable rod in, make sure I get it through both layers, so that's through the brick work. Now I need to try and find the hole in the timber, there we go, that's now through, and that is now through the underfloor void. So what we now do is go upstairs, find this rod, and bring a cable out. Okay, so now we're back inside, and I've pulled that rod through, and we have it here. So I've taped the cable on as well, so what we can now do is push this cable to outside, pull it through, and we'll have the cable on the outside. A couple little quick tips when you're doing this as well. When you're taping the cable to the rod, try and use only one piece of tape rather than lots of little small bits. Just use one long piece of tape because it makes it much easier to untape it at the end rather than picking off lots of bits of small tape. And also, when you're done wrapping it up, just fold a little tab over on the end of the tape, and again, it just makes it so much easier to untape it. And it's the sort of thing, if you're doing it a lot, pulling a lot of cable runs, that can save an absolute ton of time. So what we'll now do is get that pushed roughly into position, feed it through from the inside, just so if it gets stuck in the hole, I can kind of jiggle it through. There we go. And now, if we go outside, that cable should, I think, yeah, it should be hanging out the wall. I can actually feel it falling under the weight of the rod, so, yep, that should be through. And there we go, yep, that's the cable hanging outside. So, I probably won't pull more through than this. I'll leave a decent coil under the floor, so if it ever needed to be changed in the future, serviced, fixed, whatever, there's a coil of cable for that. So what we can now do is get this untaped and get the camera installed. And with that, it's now time to mount the camera on the wall. Now, you'll notice this is actually a slightly different camera. The other one we looked at earlier, I just wanted to get that completely on the wall, off camera, so I could learn how to do it, and then now I'll do another camera on camera, so you can actually see the process now I've figured it out. Because the order of operations for getting this on is a little bit fiddly. So I've got the cable poking through the wall, and I've already marked out the 3 screw holes and put plugs in so we can get the camera mounted onto that. So what we now need to do is get the connector onto this cable, and then before we do that, we also need to install the waterproof gland onto the cable so it can make a waterproof connection into the camera. So let's go and get that done. Okay, so that's the connector now mounted, so I've put a connector onto the cable, and I've also installed this waterproof gland, so it's a 3-part thing you need to install onto there before you mount the camera. Now, with this particular gland on this HikVision camera, you can actually slide this over a completed RJ45 connector, but I wouldn't rely on that for all cameras, so you're much better getting this on and then putting your connector on just to make sure that definitely fits over it. So what happens when we install the camera, we'll plug that in, tighten that gland up, there's a little rubber wash we'll need to put in as well, and then we can install the camera. So what we now need to do is install the camera onto the wall. Obviously we had the plugs earlier, I've just hammered them a little bit deeper into the wall just to get them past the render, so they're actually into the blockwork rather than just screwing and fixing it into the render and then that could fall off. So that's recessed in there. So now the best order of operations I've figured out is the next thing we want to do is then mount the camera over this. Obviously we want to ideally seal this hole up, but I find that if you try and seal it and then mount the camera, the movement on the cable will just end up causing the sealant just to fall out and move everywhere and won't really work. So what works much better is to get the camera on, get the cable bent round inside the camera, and then once the camera is installed, remove the camera itself from its back plate. The cable will all stay in place, then seal the hole up through the camera's back plate. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. So what I need to do is get this glanded and connected into the camera, get the camera on the wall, and then we can seal it up. Okay, so that's the camera now all connected, so it's all glanded in there, so that's completely waterproof. And then what I've also done is I've taped up the additional DC connection. The manual just says to tape up any additional cables that you aren't using. So on this camera, it's just this DC barrel jack that already has a rubber plug in the end as well. But other cameras might have alarm connections, various things like that. So just tape all them up so they don't get moisture into them. So what I need to do is carefully get this onto the wall, which I won't be able to really do on camera because that's going to be a bit awkward. But essentially what we need to do is neatly bundle up the cable in the back of the camera, probably push a fair bit of the slack up into the wall. Obviously I'll be sealing the hole, but there'll be plenty of slack I can pull back out. And actually I'm not pulling this up and pushing this into the wall, I'm pushing it through the wall, through the cavity and into the underfloor void on the other side, so it's going straight up through the cavity at an angle. What else probably want to do is try and have where the cable comes out the wall, it reasonably slope downwards. You don't want it to kind of slope upwards, you want it to kind of slope down so any moisture that does get onto this does run down the cable away from the wall, not into the wall, even though it will be sealed. So yeah, we need to try and loop as much of this cable as possible neatly into the bottom of the camera, leave a bit of slack so I can still have slack here so the camera can move around on its base. You don't want to sort of take it straight away and tie it around one of these screw posts because then you won't have enough slack to actually adjust the camera. But yep, try and get all this looped in, into the camera, and get it screwed back onto the wall. And with that, the camera's now on the wall. Oh, light's coming on, light's definitely fading. Put a security light in as well, that was a different day's project, that was a fun little project to do. Didn't bother filming that, but yeah. Camera's now on the wall. So what we've now got is that's also screwed back to the wall, but the final thing we need to do is seal where that cable comes through the wall, which as I mentioned earlier is easy to do once the camera's already on. So what we need to do is we want to take the camera back off the wall, but rather than removing the main bracket with the actual screws it's screwed to the wall with, we instead just want to take the camera off and leave the back plate in place, which also holds all the cabling in place. So to do that, on top of the camera, you'll see this little Torx screwdriver bit. Torx screw. If you undo that screw, this piece of metal will lift up, and when that lifts up, you can remove the camera from the base. So we'll do that and get that hole filled. Okay, so now the camera precariously hanging off the wall, being very careful not to scratch it against the render. We can now see here we are inside the camera, so we've got the cable and all that waterproof connector is now looped around inside there. You are going to have quite tight bends on the Cat6 cable. It's just unavoidable inside these cameras. Yes, that's probably over tolerance, but it's 100 meg Ethernet, it'll be fine. You just kind of have to put up with that. But yeah, that's now bent round. So now we can see inside here, we've now got access to that hole where the cable comes through the wall. And because the cable's all tight inside this bracket, this isn't going to move anywhere, so I don't need to worry about that moving while the sealant cures. So So what I need to do is put a bunch of waterproof sealant into that hole, and then we should be done. Cool, so you maybe just make out in there. I've now sealed that hole up with waterproof outdoor sealant, so that's now sealed. So now we just need to get the camera back on the base, and then we'll be done. There we go, all back on the wall, now sealed up. So now we can put this decorative ring back on, so just try and find where that's to line up to. There we go, turn that round, and that's now on. Final thing to do is peel off protective film, and that is the camera now completely mounted. Okay, so that's the camera now installed on the back of the house. You can all see this is that 8 megapixel one with the built-in speaker, so you can see the speaker grill on it there. So yep, that's the one we already took a look at installing. And then on the side of the house we have the other camera we took a look at installing, all sitting up there now up and working, and that's been working absolutely fine for a little while. And then since then I've also added this camera onto the front of the house next to the garage. And then on the inside of the garage, we already had this trunking that I installed previously for the alarm keypad and the alarm wiring. So the Cat6 cable for that camera comes through all that trunking there, and then it comes through the wall into the back of this back box, and I just put a back box on there with a blank plate, just so I can maintain a little coil of extra cable inside there, just in case I ever needed it. So that's for the camera up there. And then finally over at the rack, we've got the NVR just sitting on a rack shelf. So I've got a little shelf here, got the NVR there, and you can see just down there got the power supply just zip tied to it as well. So that sits there. Of course, eventually this will be upgraded to probably a 2U rack mount machine. It'll be a lot better, but this will do the job for now, and it sits there working absolutely fine. So that's 3 of the cameras installed and the NVR all up and running, and the system's now installed and working. I've still got 2 more cameras to install, but I won't do them in this video just because it's going to take a lot more time to do it. I need to run more cables for those, whereas all these cameras I already had cables pre-installed. So I'll do that all after this video in the future. But yep, that's all up and running. So what we'll now do is we'll quickly jump in and take a look at the Frigate software, and then we'll wrap all this up. Okay, so the cameras all now installed, let's take a quick look at the software side of things, both the configuration of the cameras and then the Frigate software itself. So first up we have the web interface for one of the cameras. When you first connect these HikVision cameras up, they don't get an IP address over DHCP or anything like that, they just get set up with a static IP address. So you need to set your machine to have an IP address on the same subnet as the camera, go in, and then through there you can set it to use DHCP or change it to use a different static IP address, which is what I've done here. That's all easy enough to do. You can go into configuration and then I think it's network settings, and you can just set it all up in here. I also opted to update all the cameras to the newest firmware version. The version they came with was a little bit out of date, and actually after updating it, it's got a completely different web interface, so it's probably worth doing that as well. And then now we're in the camera, obviously you can get a live view here. I'm not going to go into this in full detail, obviously there's better videos of HikVision cameras, but this is the live view of the camera. Currently it's night, so it's showing an IR night vision. You can go into configuration here where you can configure the video stream, so you can pick the different resolutions that you might want, the bit rate, all that kind of stuff, the frame rate you can pick. And what you can also do in here is change it to H.265 for higher efficiency video compression. And what I've also done here is I've changed the iframe interval, which is the interval that's used between keyframes for the H.264 compression, to 25, and then the substream I've set it to 6. Basically, I've set the iframe interval to match the frame rate. This isn't the default, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure it has keyframes less frequently than the frame rate, but setting the iframe interval to the same as the frame rate is the recommended option for Frigate because it helps the object detection to be more responsive. I think it only does object detection on the iframes, it doesn't do it on the sort of frames in between. Something like that. It's better explained elsewhere, other people know more about this than me. But yeah, with these cameras what you'll also get is 2 separate video streams. So we have the main stream, which is the stream that we want to record to disk. And this is a full quality stream, so in this case it's a 4K stream, it's 25 frames a second. You might configure that to a different frame rate if you prefer. And then separately, you have a lower resolution substream. So this here I've configured to be 720p and to record at 6 frames a second. And this isn't used for general recording, but this is what Frigate will use for object detection. So generally for that you want a lower resolution stream at a lower frame rate, because that massively reduces the load on Frigate for doing the object detection. Frigate will then record the main stream to disk, but it won't really analyse it. So it's able to save that full high resolution 4K or 2K stream, depending on what camera I'm using, but it's then performing the actual object recognition and detection on a much lower resolution, lower frame rate stream. And these can both be pulled from the camera at the same time. So that's kind of what you'll have there. Frigate has a lot of recommendations for this kind of stuff, so I would definitely recommend checking out their documentation if you're doing this yourself. Don't try and use this video as a tutorial. I'm very much flicking through this very quickly. Next up, you have configuration options for the image. So in here you can do a bunch of different adjustments. You can change various sort of contrast type things, change different settings in here, and this is also where you can configure the supplemental light functionality of these cameras, because as I mentioned they both support infrared or a white light. So right now it's night, so the auto day night switch has switched this to a night vision. If I would switch this to day, it will turn off the infrared light and it'll just go to a kind of color night vision with no supplemental light. We'll take a look at examples of this later, but this is really impressive. So what you're seeing here is a color night vision image. There is no supplemental light from the camera, and that garden is completely pitch black. Like, you cannot see a thing. There is no light in that at all, but you do get that image. Now, this is a static image. As soon as there's motion, it completely breaks up, and we'll see what happens later, but it is quite impressive. So that's set to day. If you set it to night, it should go to night. If you set it to auto, it will switch over. And then in here, you can configure what you want to do for the supplemental light at night. So right now, set this to IR for the back garden, so it's an infrared night vision. Alternatively, you can change this to the white supplemental light. So what's now happened is the white light will have come on in front of the camera instead of the night vision. So you maybe don't get quite as good a picture, but you get color at night. So this is the kind of good thing about the hybrid cameras, is you get the option of both the IR supplemental light and the white light, whereas when you're going for the regular dark fighter or color view cameras that aren't hybrid, you have one or the other depending on what camera you've bought. Loads of other functionality in here. You generally just need to play about with it. The other thing that's worth saying is this preview here doesn't look very good. For some reason, the preview in the HikVision web interface looks much darker than the actual picture I get through in Frigate. So I don't know why that is, but yeah, it looks a lot darker here. It's actually a lot better in practice. Other configuration here, really not going into too much detail. This is where you can change the sort of on-screen display and overlay shown on the camera. Time settings, by default the camera doesn't have any kind of network time. It just kind of has a time set out the box that's completely wrong. What I ended up doing here, because I don't want the cameras to talk out to the internet, instead what I've done is I'm running an NTP server on my Frigate NVR itself, and the cameras are allowed to talk to that. So they can't talk to anything else on my local network, they're completely firewalled off, but they are allowed to talk to NTP running on my Frigate NVR just so they can get the correct date and time to show on the on-screen display overlay. And yeah, that's really most configuration you need to do in the camera. The only other stuff you need to do is set up a user. So by default, you'll have an admin user on the camera. You just need to add some sort of other user to the camera. I've just called mine viewer, set a password on that and give that permission to remote live view the camera. This is the user you'll set up in Frigate to pull video from the cameras. And yeah, I think that's basically all the configuration you might really need in here. So now the camera's set up with the appropriate video streams and the appropriate users, we can now set this up in Frigate. So now here we have the Frigate configuration. I'm not going to go into this in full detail, nor am I going to show the whole installation process. Realistically, if you're planning on using Frigate, you do need to expect to do a fair bit of learning and reading documentation. It's not a plug and play NVR by any means. But it's relatively easy to install. I was able to just install Debian Linux on the Optiplex machine, install Frigate on top of that using Docker. I think it's a Docker setup I used, and it all just works. A little bit fiddling to try and get the appropriate drivers installed for that Coral TPU, but again, it's all documented. It was fairly easy to set up. And then when it comes to configuring Frigate, a lot of the very basic config is done through this YAML file, which thankfully you can edit through the Frigate web interface. You just need to go down to this menu here, Configuration Editor, and you can edit it all through the web interface. Now, when I first saw that Frigate's configured through a YAML file, I kind of thought, oh no, it's going to be a complete nightmare to configure. I don't mind using YAML to set core configuration up, but I didn't want to have to dip into it constantly. But to be honest, it's actually not that bad at all. Realistically, all you need to set up in the YAML file initially is things like your MQTT settings and the connections to all your cameras. Once that's set up, all this other stuff here around masks and object detection, that can all then be configured through the web interface. And what you do is you configure it in the interface, we'll take a look at that later, and it then writes that to the YAML file. So a lot of the configuration I haven't actually set up here. It's been done by the web interface itself. But in here you need to set up the cameras. So you see we've got various different cameras in here. So we've got a cameras section here, and we've got a set for each of my cameras. So back, garden, side path, and garage. And inside each of these cameras, what you have is we have the inputs. So we have the two different streams from the camera. So that's the thing we talked about before. So we have one stream here for the main stream, which on this camera is 101, and the second stream is the substream, that's 102. Different cameras will have different stream URLs, so you'll have to figure that out based on the camera's documentation. And it's just a case of the username, the password, which of course I've blanked out for this video, the IP address, port, and that sort of stuff there. And as we can see here, each stream has a different role. So the main stream, which is the full resolution stream, has a role of record, and that lower resolution substream has a role of detect. And then this detect object here I've set up with saying I've enabled detection, and I've put the same width and height as the resolution of the substream. And I've done that for all the cameras. All the other stuff in here around motion detection, object detection, zones, this is all set up through the web interface. But yep, that's all I really need to set up for each of the camera configurations. Then for detectors, what we have here is we've defined that we have a Coral TPU that we're using for the detection, and it's the PCI version. You may need to change this if you're using a USB version. In here, you can then define the objects you want to track for object detection. Currently, I've just set person, car, dog, and cat. You might want to change this, and I'm probably going to expand this and try out different things here in the future. Then finally down here, there's some stuff about record settings. To be honest, I can't even remember what I'd set there and why I set it up like that. I really need to go into this configuration and actually tweak it to my preferences once I've used the system a little bit more. But yeah, that's what I've set up there. You'd really need to read the documentation to know kind of how you want your recordings to work. But with all that set up, it now works. So what we can now do is go back to the main Frigate interface. And as you can see here, we're getting a feed from all of my cameras. Now, I'm only going to show the back garden camera in this video, just because it's a fairly nondescript back garden, whereas the other cameras potentially could show identifying areas, number plates on cars, things like that. So I kind of want to keep them blurred out. But what you can see here, we have the back garden camera here and then the two other camera feeds here. Now, as you can see right now, the back garden camera is completely black and white with IR night vision. That's because with the back garden, it's so dark that while the color night vision does get a picture, as soon as there's any motion, it completely breaks up and isn't really usable. So for the back garden, I've decided to use night vision, use IR at night, just because it gives a much clearer image of what's happening in the scene. Whereas the front of the house and the side of the house, which unfortunately I can't really show, I've decided to set those up with color night vision. And to be honest, even without the white supplemental light, the picture from it is absolutely brilliant. At the front of the house, there is some street lights, but they're fairly eco LED street lights that don't cast that much light. But to be honest, the picture from from the color night vision on this is absolutely brilliant. Even without any kind of supplemental light, it's a completely usable picture. Again, you can't really see it right now, but I'm looking at a picture of a car and I can literally read the number plate on the car, on the driveway. It's incredible. So the color night vision is absolutely brilliant, as long as there's a reasonable bit of light out there. And we'll take a look at some examples later. What we can then do is we can click onto a camera. So if we click that camera, it'll pull it up as a full screen feed. That's a camera running live, that's a live video feed from it. And then in here, you can press history, which will bring up the playback interface. So then in here, we're seeing a live feed from the camera. And what I can then do is on the right hand side, you'll see there's a little timeline and we can drag this up and down to scrub through the footage. And then these little sort of spikes on it show motion. So when it's detected some sort of motion or something's happened in the scene, it kind of the graph gets a little bit higher to kind of indicate the amount of motion that's been detected. So if we flick through that, see what happens. So that was me playing about with the lights, and it was just because I was changing settings on the camera, that obviously triggered Frigate to detect motion. Likewise, if we go back further in time down here, we'll probably see here, that was when I turned the lights on downstairs. You can see it again, it detected a change in the scene there. And of course, this is just sort of random changes really in the scene. It's not actual motion detection events. But if we scroll further down, what we'll find is where I was actually testing the camera earlier and actually went out into the garden. And if we go there, you'll see that's a test of me there. And because it detected a person there, it highlights it as a red section on the timeline. So it makes it really easy to find all your events. And you can very easily scrub through. The scrubbing performance of this is absolutely brilliant. This is something I was a bit worried about, going to something like Frigate that's PC based and not maybe as refined as something like a completely off the shelf NVR. But to be honest, the scrubbing performance of this, bear in mind this is 4K footage, is really, really impressive. It works absolutely brilliantly. And of course, this is a web interface we're currently looking at the interface on desktop, but this interface also works brilliantly on mobile. When I first installed Frigate, I wasn't sure whether I was going to use Frigate as the full-time NVR or whether I'd use Frigate for things like object detection and alerting, and then use some sort of other NVR with maybe a more refined app for just general day-to-day access. But to be honest, the Frigate web interface is actually up there with one of my favourite NVR web interfaces. It's not quite Unify Protect, it's still my favourite, but this is really slick, and even on mobile, this works brilliantly. So yeah, that's kind of how you'd scrub footage from a camera. Of course, you've got multiple cameras, you can do the exact same thing. You can go into here, you can change how long you want to look back at. You can put filters, so you can filter to highlight particular alerts you want to see on your timeline if you want to see particular types of objects. So you can filter to only see people, filter out any other objects you're seeing. It works brilliantly. So next up, let's take a look at the sort of general configuration you can do through the Frigate web interface, because it's not all done through that YAML file. So this is settings section within Frigate. There's various options here around different playback stuff. You can then go into camera settings. This is where you can do things about how you deal with reviews and detections. I haven't really used this section, to be honest, but the main interesting thing is around the masks and zones and motion tuning. So if we go into masks and zones, this shows us a feed from a camera. We've currently got the back garden camera. And what you can do here is you can set up masks where you can define areas that you don't want to detect motion. So what I found is because it gives you that nice sort of graph view of how much motion there is on a timeline, some things would interfere with that. So for example, there's an area here where you can kind of just about catch the tops of some tall vehicles going past. And then this clock here, because it changes, would constantly show motion on the timeline because these pixels here were changing. You kind of get a bigger spike every minute and every hour because more digits would change. So all you do is you create a motion mask over here, just click some points on it, and these are now excluded from any of the motion calculations and on that graph. What you can also do in here you can define zones. So we define a zone here. What you can do is you can pick a point on the map, pick an area of the map, and decide which objects you want to detect in that particular area. A good example of this is if we flip over to my garage camera. We have this camera here, and it covers a sort of area in the front of the house, front garden, driveway, that kind of thing. But the issue with it is I want to detect people if they're coming close to the front of the house, not if someone just happens to step onto the garden or into the driveway, because we're on one of those new style so-called shared spaces streets that doesn't have pavements, because that makes sense. So basically you have to walk up the middle of the road, and if there's a car coming, quite often people will step just onto the bottom of the drive or onto the garden just to let it pass. So I don't want to detect that. But what I do want is if someone, say, walks up the driveway to the front door or stands around the garage, I want that to be detected as an alert. So what I've done here is I've defined a zone called within boundary, where I've just selected the area that I want to actually track people. And then in here, we say that within that area, I want to detect people. Don't care about cats, dogs, or cars, I just want people. What that means is with Frigate, there's a concept of separate detections and alerts, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So those detections set up in the config file, where I've set car, cat, dog, and person, if a person, cat, dog, or car is detected in a scene, that will be classed as a detection. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be classed as an alert. For example, it's nice to maybe have a detections area I can scrub through and find any cats or dogs that walk through the garden. But I don't want an alert if a cat walks through the garden. So what you can do here is I can set up a zone, say I want to only detect people in this area. And with that set up, what I can then do is go over to camera settings, and I can then say I want to receive alerts from the within boundary zone. That means I will only get an alert if that zone is triggered, which is a particular area of the driveway and garden, and it's only set up for people. So I'll only receive an alert if it's a person, but I'll still receive detection for any other sorts of objects there. And you can see this here, so this is set up on a per camera basis, so alerts have to be within the boundary, detections are not limited to a particular zone, so that means the detections work throughout the entire area and with all object types. So that's what I've set up there, and it works really well. The only thing I found that was a little bit awkward to deal with is things like cars. So, or basically detecting objects that are always in the scene. Because when I first set this up, I thought, oh, it could be quite useful to maybe have detections that detect the car on the driveway. So if the car disappeared or appears, I would get alerts knowing if the car's there or not. The problem with that is the object detection isn't perfect. So it generally will detect there's a car there or if there's not a car there. But what will happen is it'll occasionally blip with just different frames, changes in lighting, things like that. And the car will appear to maybe disappear for a couple of frames and then come back. And the problem with that is if I enabled it to detect cars within this boundary and had that set up to store alerts based on a car being present, you would just throughout the night end up with just hundreds of recordings of the car because it would just sort of disappear and reappear. So I've decided to only set that for people, and that works absolutely fine. The next section you have here is for motion detection, so you can sort of tune this, and it's basically how many pixels have to change before Frigate classes an area as having motion detected. So you might need to change that just to kind of stop it having constantly detecting motion. For example, right now you can see those red boxes are appearing where it's seeing motion. That's nothing too bad, but if I turn this up really low, I think low would be the wrong way to do it. If I made that really low, you're going to end up seeing a lot of just little motion events kind of popping up all over the frame, and that's just too many. So I kind of tuned that to, I think 40 I decided for the back garden was sensible, and that works better. And that just means I don't have too many motion detections on the timeline. It just keeps the timeline a bit cleaner. The final area that's interesting in here is debug. And this is really useful for fine-tuning things like object detection. So you can overlay different things on the image. So You can overlay things like motion masks, so that's blacked out the areas that I've set the motion masks on. You can sort of have motion boxes, which will show areas where it sees things moving. You can also have zones. There's no zones in the back garden, but if there was one, you could switch that on. But the really useful feature here is bounding boxes. So when you're dealing with object detection, what this will do is if it sees an object in the scene, it'll put a box around it, put the name of what it thinks it is, if it's a person, dog or cat, and also puts a percentage sort of confidence interval in it. Or you can go to this object list and it'll list all the objects that it's detected in the scene. Of course, there's nothing really in the scene right now, but if I was to walk out into the back garden, it would put a box around me, put person, and put a kind of percentage as to how confident it is that it's detected a person there. So this is really useful when you're more fine-tuning your kind of settings. So there you go. That's a look at the sort of configuration you can do through the Frigate web interface. The only thing you might notice that's not available here is any kind of way to mask out areas of the image and black them out. Now that's intentional. Generally speaking, you don't set that up on the NVR. Instead, you set that up on the camera. So that way the camera is blacking out that area, say a window or somewhere you don't want, or an area of someone else's land. It'll black it out on the camera itself, so even the video feed from the camera doesn't contain that area. That's pretty normal, and that's generally how almost all CCTV systems work. It's just if you've used some more consumer systems or more user-friendly systems, say Unify Protect, that kind of abstraction gets a little bit blurred because sometimes you're maybe feel like you're configuring it through the NVR or using an app that's talking to the NVR, but actually generally what happens is that configuration around those masks actually does get uploaded to the cameras, and it's the cameras that blacks them out. So yeah, if you want to do any of that kind of stuff, you do that through the cameras, not through the Frigate web interface. And with that setup, it absolutely works brilliantly. So of course we've seen how you can live view a camera and look at the history. The final thing to take a look at is how the detection and events work. So if we come over to here, you have the section for review, and in here you've got two different tabs. Now I'm going to just set this to just the back garden right now, just so I don't show any of the cameras I don't want. And on here you have three different tabs: alerts and detections and motion. Now motion is essentially a timeline view where it just shows this sort of allows you to scrub the timeline, or you can set motion only and just see where you've had motion events. And that's literally just motion, pixels have changed, nothing much more than that. Where Frigate gets really useful is in terms of detections and alerts. So you have the detections tab, and this is anytime Frigate has detected any of the objects you've listed in the configuration file within the frame. So in my case, that's person, cat, dog, and car. Right now, this is set to last 24 hours. I've cleared this out just to not show lots of random stuff, and I think it's just hasn't really detected stuff in the last 24 hours. But what this would show up here is things like if a cat goes through the garden, that would show in this. If a car goes through the garden, something's gone badly wrong, but that would show up in here. All that kind of stuff. It just shows a big list of detections. That's great, but it's not particularly useful because I don't care about a cat going through the garden. I don't want that. What I really want is if a person goes through the garden, I want to be able to see that and see what was happening. And that's where alerts are useful. So this is because what I've set up here is I want an alert if a person is detected in the back garden. And that's what we have here. So we have this alerts tab here. I've reviewed all these. So the way it works is they show up here. You can then click them all and view them all. And once they're reviewed, they disappear. So if I press show reviewed, this shows all the alerts that were in the back garden in the last 24 hours, which is basically me testing the camera. We'll take a look at the footage that we recorded here. Because of my configuration, I've said a person in the back garden is classed as an alert, not just a detection. And then we have all those videos. It's the same for all the cameras. If I were to pull up the camera from the front garden, for example, there'd be a bunch of detections throughout the day. Anytime, say, a delivery person comes to the door, you see an alert for that, and you'll be able to click that and see the person going to the door. We can then click on any of these videos, and it'll just play it back. So this works absolutely brilliantly. It's a really slick interface. If I then press live, it'll take me to live view from that camera. And that's kind of how the detections work. It really works well. And of course, this can then further be integrated in things like MQTT and various other systems to pull it into Home Assistant and trigger notifications based on events. It's really, really powerful. And then finally, if you wanted to ever pull footage off the system, export it, it's very easy to do. You just go into the camera, either through a particular alert or just on the camera's history view, press export. You can then pick last hour, last 4 hours, or you can even just pick select from timeline, which is generally what I would do. Click that. You can then pick a timeline range that you want to export, click save export, and that'll export it. And then if you come over to this area here for export, here we have all the recordings that I've exported from the camera. So they'll all show up in here, and you can just click the download button and it will download that file to disk. So there you go. That was a very quick probably actually not very quick, rambly run through of the Frigate web interface and all the configuration. I do apologise, that was probably extremely boring and a massive ramble. This was not planned at all, but kind of just thought I'd just give you a rough idea of how it all works and how I found it. And to be honest, I'm very happy with it. Realistically, I see no requirement to have any other NVR here to use for day-to-day stuff. Just taking the Frigate web interface, setting up a shortcut on my phone to kind of add a shortcut to launch Frigate to the home screen, and that is all I need. This has worked absolutely brilliantly as an NVR. I'm so happy with it. So what we'll finally do is we'll take a look at some of the footage from some of the cameras, in particular taking a look at the different night vision modes, talk about how we can get alerts out of Frigate and into Home Assistant, and then we'll wrap all this up. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to take a look at was the general video quality from these cameras. And it's very, very good. Now, I'm not going to go into doing huge loads of performance tests with these, obviously that I could do that, but it's just not really my area of expertise, and there's a lot of better videos of these exact same cameras out there. But I kind of want to just sort of talk about them and give my thoughts. So here with the back garden camera kind of in daylight, so this is around about midday, and as you can see, the picture quality is incredible. This is a 4K camera, it's really, really good, you can see so much detail. There's definitely a fair bit of digital sharpening going on, but it is a really, really clear image. And what you can see there is just how bright it is. Now, of course, this is midday, so you're going to get a fairly bright image. But let's go back to sort of early in the day, back towards the morning. So say 8 AM, which would have been fairly dark. You're getting a pretty good image. Go back before that. We'll find the point that it was switched over to night vision, would have been round about here. So that was it in night vision, and then using IR, and then it's come round to colour round about here. To be honest, that would have been pretty dark outside, and that is still a really good image. Now, of course, if we jump to the current time and see the garden right now, you'll see it is currently black and white using IR. What I found with the night vision on this is, of course, you can either have the colour night vision or you can have infrared. I find that the back garden is potentially a little bit too dark to use the colour night vision. As we saw earlier, when you switch it on, you get an absolutely brilliant image. It actually looks like a perfect colour image. But if there's any motion in that image, it completely breaks up. So we have an example here. So what I've done here is I've set the camera up to use colour night vision. So right now what you're getting there is a colour image from the camera, and there is no light on at all. And to be honest, this garden is so dark that you basically can't even see where you're going. I almost fell over when I was filming this because I couldn't actually see where I was going. It's completely dark. So this sort of image looks absolutely incredible. But what I'll do in a second is you'll see me walk out the door, and you'll see what happens when there's motion in this kind of, when it's that dark and you're using colour night vision. So let's see what happens. So I walk out there. You can see what I'm wearing, but I'm kind of a ghost. I'm very much, you can see my arm is disappearing because it's moving. It really, really struggles with motion when it is that dark and you're using the colour night vision. You can turn the supplemental light on. So here we have a clip where I've now enabled the supplemental white light on the camera. So it's a bit brighter, there's a white light coming out the front of the camera. I find you do need to be quite careful with this though, because as you can see, the camera's angled against the wall, and the wall is really, really lit up by the supplemental light. The infrared does it as well, but not quite as badly. So you do need to, at that point, potentially play about with the exposure settings so you don't end up kind of having the rest of the image get too dark because of a bright area here. But I've turned on the supplemental light here. It's not super bright, and what I mean by that is it's not like having a floodlight in your garden. So this camera's obviously up on the wall of the back garden. You've got the kitchen window there and back door there. When I was in the kitchen looking out the window, you couldn't even really tell that there was a light on out there. It's not that bright at all, and it's quite a nice warm white, so it's actually quite a nice little light to have. But it doesn't add much light, but it does make a bit of a difference. So we'll see me do the same test again here, but now with supplemental light on. So with that little bit of additional white light in the scene. Wait for me to walk outside. There we go. Now I'm quite far from the camera here, so right now you see it's maybe a little bit better, but it is still very, very blurry, and the motion still does break up, and I still look a bit like a ghost. I think when I did this test, I was just that little bit too far from the supplemental light. So I did another test where I walked much closer to the camera, and you can see that you do get a much better result here. So coming closer in, closer to that supplemental light, and as you can see now, that's pretty good. It was really, really dark there. I could barely see where I was going, but that was just enough light from that supplemental light to get a reasonable colour night vision image. So that's kind of what the colour night vision looks like in almost a worst case scenario, because that garden is completely pitch black. At the front of the house and the side of the house, basically all the other cameras, there's enough lights coming from street lights or a security light on the side of the house that I've just basically set them to use the colour night vision the entire time. And you get an absolutely perfect image. People look absolutely brilliant. Motion actually works fine. You don't really get that ghosting. But in a situation like this where the garden is completely dark, it does definitely struggle. So in the back garden, because of that, I've opted to set that up to use IR night vision. So if you look at the same test again using infrared night vision, here, where I come out again, and you'll see it is just a much better image. Now, of course, it's black and white, and it's not amazing, but you can see I don't look as much like a ghost. I mean, I do, in the sense I'm completely white in black and white, but I don't disappear, my head doesn't disappear while I'm walking. And that's because the infrared just generally works a little bit better in low light. But the trade-off, of course, is that you lose detail, things can look a bit weird and unnatural, and you can't do, say, for example, identify colours of clothing and things like that. But this also shows the real benefit of having these hybrid cameras, because I was able to put the same cameras up everywhere and then decide what I want to do in terms of supplemental light or white light or colour night vision or IR night vision based on my experience using the cameras. So with my setup here, I've decided to use infrared night vision in the back garden because it's just so dark, the colour night vision just doesn't really work that well when there's motion. However, at the side of the house, the front of the house, all the other cameras, there's just enough light coming in from, say, street lights or security lights, things like that, that I leave them on colour night vision the entire time, and they work brilliantly. And that combination works really nicely, because realistically, you wouldn't be able to get into this garden without passing one of the other cameras on the house first. So the other cameras in the house are all doing a colour image, even at night, so you'd be able to easily see what colour of clothing someone's wearing, things like that. And then if they were to get into the back garden, hopefully not, you would then get this night vision image through infrared, and you'd be able to see quite clearly what they were doing in the garden. Is it someone trying to break in, or is it just someone who's lost their ball over the fence and is coming to try and get it? So it's really, really nice with these cameras having that hybrid setting where you can kind of pick what works best for a particular application. I could take it even further, for example, and have night vision normally, but then if a person was detected, then switch over to the supplemental light. But I'm not really going to go into that detail yet. But yeah, that's a quick look at the cameras and sort of rough video quality. Apologies for not being the most in-depth, detailed view or anything. I don't really have good camera angles to test with here. But hopefully that kind of showed roughly what I'm experiencing here. But of course, if you want to see full videos of these cameras, there's much better content out there. Finally, let's take a look at how we can pull the data from Frigate into Home Assistant and then use that for things like creating alerts. So to set all this up, you need to install the Frigate add-on, follow the documentation to install that. It needs to be installed as a third-party repository. And then once that's set up, we can go into here and it detects all the devices. So we've got our cameras there. The garage one isn't detected. I think I just need to reload the add-on to pull that in because I only just installed that the other day. I'm not going to risk doing that right now though, because there's some events collected in here I want to show in this video, and I don't want to risk reloading it and losing the events that are already stored. We have the cameras in here, so we go into the back garden camera, and then under each camera we can see all the different events it's detecting. So right now there's a sort of stream of events coming from the camera where it's detecting motion. Of course, the motion detection isn't super useful because, you know, there's bits of rain and dust blowing past the camera and that's enough to trigger it. So we're getting motion events, that's not particularly useful. But what's more useful is where you can pull the object detection in. So here we have all the objects I've set up in Frigate, and these have been pulled through into Home Assistant. There's some of these I was testing with that I've since removed, so that's what these are down here, because Frigate can apparently detect shoes and toasters, so I was testing with that. And if any of my neighbours looked out the window and saw me running around the garden waving a toaster in the air, they were probably a bit confused as to what I was doing. Also, it didn't detect a toaster, I was very disappointed. But yeah, you can detect all these objects, but here are the objects we're currently configured to detect, so car, cat, dog and person. And what happens here is anytime any of these objects is detected, these sensors in Home Assistant will react. For example, here we have the different objects. So last time a person was detected in the garden was 11th of February. That was the day when I was doing the testing. Click that, you get an image from the camera showing the detection. Here we have a dog, so we can click that. Last time a dog was detected in the garden was back in December. Here is the very good boy highlighted. He was 83% dog apparently, so that works there. Then cat, again, same thing. Highlights it, 80% cat, so that's what it's 80%. It's the confidence that it thinks that's a cat, so it detects that absolutely fine. So you've got these alerts here, so you could create triggers, for example, that, or automations in Home Assistant, that if a person is detected in the garden, then send some sort of notification. In fact, for my setup here, because my burglar alarm state is also available in Home Assistant, what I'm going to configure is an automation that if a person is detected in the back garden and the burglar alarm is armed, then immediately phone me. because realistically the garden is through a locked gate. No one should be going into the back garden unless they're probably breaking in. Like, it would be quite bad if someone was in the back garden. But of course I don't want to be alerted just anytime I go in the back garden, because if I go in the back garden I don't want to get a phone call about that. So because I can integrate the two things into the one automation, I can say if the burglar alarm is armed, I'm not going to be at home, the house is going to be unoccupied. So if a person's detected in the back garden, that's probably a bad thing and I want to be told about it. Likewise, if the burglar alarm is armed at night, same thing, it would trigger an automation. And that's going to be super easy to do with this because I have person sensors. A sensor will detect if a person's in the garden, and the alarm status is also pulled into this. You also get this occupancy. Sensors is basically saying person occupancy is currently clear. It'll change between occupancy and clear depending if there's a person in the garden or not. Likewise, same for dog and cat. So if I go cat occupancy, you can see that. You can of course even plot it over time, so you can see a graph of how many people were in the garden over plotted out historically, so you can bring that in there. So if you've ever wanted a graph of the occupancy of your garden, there you go. So you can see one person, 2 people in the garden. It's pretty cool. Not sure what I would use this for, but it's quite cool just to have all that data collected. So yeah, that's kind of the Home Assistant setup. Very easy to get working. You can take it further. You can, for example, pull the sort of interface from Frigate into Home Assistant, kind of view the cameras through here as well. I've also got it set up here. If I go into my dashboard, the back garden camera feed is actually used as the cover for the area for the garden. It works really, really nicely. So yeah, that's like the Home Assistant side of things. I haven't set up all the automations yet. I still need to get all that done and to kind of fine tune everything. But I'll probably do another sort of just general update video at some point in the future. And at that point, I'll kind of cover the Frigate automations and all the alerts that I've set up. But yeah, that's Home Assistant side of things. So there you have it. That was a look at my new CCTV setup. I apologise for the software bit dragging on. That was quite a long ramble about all the software side of things. In fact, I'm just editing that video right now and I realise how much I talked about the software side of things. But hopefully you found this interesting or potentially useful if you're looking to try this sort of setup out. Still got these 2 final cameras to install, so I'll do that at some point in the future. And then after that, I'll also be building the brand new dedicated rack mount NVR. So that'll be really cool as well, so stay tuned for that. So hopefully you found this interesting or useful if you're trying to set up a Frigate NVR yourself. But also let's say now, thank you very much for watching.